BBC News now on BBC One with Huw Edwards and Louisa Preston.
Tonight at 10, record borrowing and tax rises. The Chancellor's response to the worst recession since the Second World War. Mr Darling's budget reveals the toxic state of the economy and he announces unprecedented borrowing to try to put it right.
Our own figures for public sector net borrowing will be £175 billion this year, or some 12% of GDP.
The worst recession since World War II and the worst peacetime public finances ever known. As of today, any claim they have ever made to economic competence is dead over, finished.
The wealthiest are targeted with a higher top rate of income tax and lower pension relief. Drinkers and motorists will also share the burden as duties rise. And a warning that public spending will have to be cut back radically in the years ahead. We'll be asking how credible the government's plans and predictions really are. Also tonight, freed without charge, police release all the suspects arrested in the recent anti-terror raids. After last year's SATS chaos, the former exams chief says he was made a scapegoat by ministers. And did Manchester United do enough tonight to regain the top spot?
On BBC London News, a gimmick which pokes the rich in the eye. The Mayor slams the budget for damaging the city. And new pictures emerge showing Ian Tomlinson after being pushed at the G20 protests.
Good evening. Tax rises, public spending cuts and record levels of borrowing. That's the Chancellor's response to the sharpest recession since the Second World War. Alistair Darling's budget has now set the terms of the political debate as we approach the next election. He announced record borrowing of £175 billion this year and estimated more than £700 billion of borrowing over the next 5 years. We'll have the details and the reaction. Our economics editor, Stephanie Flanders, on the scale of the nation's debt and the plans to repay it. Our business editor, Robert Peston, on the tax rises for higher earners and what they could mean. But first, our political editor, Nick Robinson, on the day the Chancellor made clear how bad things are.
This is a budget that made history, not because of any secret the Chancellor had hidden in his famous red box, but thanks to the grim facts that lay inside.
Is there a black hole in the box, Chancellor?
Those facts confirm the toxic state of a British economy facing the sharpest recession, the highest borrowing and the biggest spending squeeze since the Second World War. Alistair Darling headed to the Commons knowing that he'd have to tell MPs that things were worse, much worse, than he'd set out just a few months ago. His case is that they're worse everywhere else as well.
Our own figures for public sector net borrowing will be £175 billion this year, or some 12% of GDP.
Just look at the faces of his fellow ministers as they take in the news that borrowing won't come under control for almost another decade.
Today's budget will take Britain through the most serious global economic turmoil for over 60 years. The impact is being felt in every continent, every country, every community.
The lesson from the past, he said, was that government should carry on spending more now to help the victims of the recession.
I want to offer a guarantee. From January, everyone under the age of 25 who's been out of work for 12 months will be offered a job or a place in training.
The alternative was a return to the 80s, when he claimed a whole generation were abandoned to a future on the scrap heap. There is, of course, a price to be paid for this help. Petrol duties on the rise again, the price of alcohol's going up too. No surprise there, but there was one to get the wealthy reaching for a stiff drink.
In November, I announced a new rate of income tax of 45% on incomes above £150,000. That's the top 1% of taxpayers. In order to help pay for additional support for people now and to invest in the future, I've decided that the new rate will be 50% and will come in from April next year, a year earlier.
Those Labour cheers were for a promise to break their own election manifesto. A promise Tony Blair regarded as so important that he signed it in his own hand and that Gordon Brown repeated at the last election.
Our tax promises are that we will not raise the basic or top rates of income tax.
The Treasury also has real pain planned for other government departments, spending plans tighter than those Labour once condemned as Tory cuts. But today, all the emphasis is still on spending even more.
Every country has been hit by this global recession, but we have confidence in Britain's future and in this country's strength. You can grow your way out of a recession, you can't cut your way out of it. We've made our choice to help people now to build Britain's future, and I commend this budget to the House.
The Tories declared this to be a day of reckoning for Labour. Their hope is that the reputations of both Chancellor and Prime Minister will disappear into the budget black hole.
This Prime Minister has certainly got himself in the history books. He has written a whole chapter in red ink, Labour's decade of debt.
If Gordon Brown thought he'd set a trap for his opponent by raising taxes on the rich, the Tory leader skirted it, condemning instead tax rises on everyone else.
These people aren't rich, these people have to work hard, and they're going to pay the price for Labour's failure. These aren't taxes for the few, they're taxes for the many, introduced by this Labour Prime Minister.
The Lib Dem leader complained that the budget didn't hit the rich or help the poorest enough.
The biggest disappointment of all in this budget today is its failure to sort out Britain's unfair tax system, to put money into people's pockets to help them make it through this recession. Britain's taxes are still too heavy on those who can least afford it and too easy to avoid for those who know how.
Outside the Treasury this afternoon, a sign of times to come. Protests against cuts by a Labour government, echoed by the Scottish Nationalists.
This whole budget today was predicated on coming out of recession this year, which no one else seems to believe, and predicated on massive cuts in the teeth of a recession. It was the wrong thing to do.
Believe it or not, the Chancellor wants people to feel optimistic at the end of this budget day. He's predicting a recovery to start at the turn of the year, and a recovery that'll be strong. If he's wrong, his next budget could replace this one in the history books. And for all the wrong reasons. Nick Robinson, BBC News, Westminster.
And we'll be talking to Nick a little later on, but let's take a look in a little more detail at some of the key measures announced today. There is a significant increase in fuel duty, up by 2 pence a litre from September, and then by another penny a litre above inflation from next April, and that's for 4 years. Tobacco duty is up 2%, that's an extra 7 pence on 20 cigarettes. Alcohol also goes up by 2%, putting a penny on an average pint of beer. But for the elderly, the state pension will rise by at least 2.5% next year, and winter fuel allowance, which is £250 for those over 60, £400 for those over 80, will be paid for another year. Now, for the housing market, the stamp duty holiday on homes worth up to £175,000, well, that's been extended. And to help the car industry and the environment, the Chancellor has introduced what he calls a car scrappage scheme, offering a £2,000 discount on a new car for trading in a car that's more than 10 years old. And for businesses, the scheme allowing loss-making companies to reclaim tax paid on old profits, well, that's been extended. And there was some help for savers. The annual limit on individual savings accounts, ISAs, has been raised to £10,200. Child tax credit goes up by £20 next year. And you can see the full details of those measures, all the budget measures, indeed, and how they affect you. You can use the little calculator that's on the site. That's on the BBC website, bbc.co.uk/budget. Now, with unprecedented levels of borrowing and debt, the Chancellor's own forecasts suggest that a return to financial stability, as we heard, is the best part of a decade away. And some analysts have warned that Mr Darling's assumptions are far too optimistic. Our economics editor, Stephanie Flanders, investigates how realistic the Chancellor's plans are to tackle record debt.
Amid all the gloom of recession and mounting debt, there's one shining hope at the Treasury upon which all this year's budget arithmetic depends. Unlike most people, the Treasury thinks a strong recovery is going to arrive bang on time. The Chancellor is expecting the economy to shrink by 3.5% this year. But then he's expecting a dramatic turnaround, with a recovery starting at the end of the year and growth of 3.5% by 2011. It has happened before, but not after a deep financial crisis like the one we've just had. The last time we had a financial crisis on this scale, the result was the Great Depression. The Chancellor said the world wasn't going to let that happen again.
When the world economy was plunged into a deep crisis in the 1930s, the response, both nationally and internationally, was too little and it was too late. And that failure to act turned a serious downturn into a prolonged depression. We will not repeat those mistakes again.
But even with his rosy forecasts, he still had to delay the date he will start to cut the level of public debt. The Chancellor confirmed that there's a much bigger hole in the budget than he thought even 6 months ago, with borrowing this year of £175 billion. Now, with borrowing at those kind of record levels, the stock of national debt is going to keep on rising and rising for years to come. Finally peaking, he thinks, at close to 80% of GDP, though many think it'll go higher still.
He's going to have to continue to raise huge sums of money in borrowing. The economy, the budget won't be back in balance for 6-7 years beyond that. And the question is it credible that we can manage this over such a period of time? If everything goes well, if the economy grows above its long-term record, at least in the short term, if we keep our fingers crossed and nothing bad happens, it'll be okay. But that's taking a risk, is what we're saying.
So how is he going to fix that budget hole? What we heard most about today were early and steep tax rises for the rich. The new 50p tax rate and other tax rises for the highest earners will raise an extra £7 billion a year by 2012. The higher fuel duty will raise about £2.2 billion by then. But only a third of the squeeze in the budget announced by the Chancellor today is coming through those higher taxes. The rest is coming by slashing public investment. That's going to be cut in half by 2013, and through the tightest public spending plan since the war.
Well, given the squeeze you've got both on capital spending and on the other spending in the public services going over a very long period, I think every area is going to be hit. Now, clearly, health and education have done relatively well in the years of plenty. They might suffer less in the years of austerity, but no one's going to escape unaffected.
The government says the drive for efficiency savings will protect frontline services, but with rising interest costs on all that debt, we are going to see real cuts in things that voters want, even if that sprightly recovery arrives on time. Stephanie Flanders, BBC News.